Exposure bracketing, the absolute foundation of modern landscape photography. In fact, it is a necessity when taking landscape photographs. How to use it? How to set it up? Let's find out. Hello, I am Jan Šmíd, a Master Qualified European photographer. With over 13 years of experience, I lead photography workshops. As one of 25 ambassadors for Carl Zeiss, I co-produce this channel with colleagues Pavel and Martin, fellow expedition lecturers. Exposure bracketing. Do you remember? In the video titled, "Do we really need graduated ND filters?" we already covered the topic of exposure bracketing. We wondered why not to use graduated filters and why to start using the bracketing method. In this video, we will explain this technique step by step. The method of exposure bracketing is nothing new in landscape photography. It was used in a specific way by landscape photographers with classic cameras decades ago. With the rise of digital cameras, the use of exposure bracketing has become much easier. This technique is essentially simple. We just take one photo multiple times. One photo will be dark, one will be medium, we can call it neutral, and one will be light. We then blend these three exposures in some photography editor. We'll take the sky from the dark exposure, the dark to black parts from the light exposure, and the rest from the neutral exposure. That's basically it. Simple, right? Why are we doing this? As we have said in previous videos, human eyes are almost perfect. They can perceive vast differences between lights and shadows. Our camera chips are much worse. Exposure bracketing increases the dynamic range of the chip, and it brings the resulting photography closer to what we saw with our eyes. So we are trying to get more dynamic range, HDR. But beware, unlike other methods that fall under HDR, we are only concerned with highlights and shadows, that is, the tonal parts of the photo. Exposure bracketing is not about colors. We adjust this to our liking when we finalize the photo in Photoshop, Lightroom, and so on. So one more time, we are doing exposure bracketing to achieve the sky that is not overexposed, and the shadows are not just 100% black. So mainly because of the sky, we are going to take a dark photo. The middle photo will be used for most of the final photo, and the light photo, or the parts of it, will be used for the shadows. That way, we'll have nice texture in them. Just to be clear, the shadow must be a shadow, so it must be dark, but we have to see something in it. If the shadow is just a black area with no texture, it has nothing to do in the photography. In a theory, now practically, how to set up bracketing. Right at the beginning, we'll be looking at the order of the photos in exposure bracketing. Almost all camera brands have the bracketing order set so that the first photo is neutral, the second is dark, the third is light. But that's useless. We need the first photo to be dark, then medium, and then light. Why? Because we have to deal with the most exposure intensive part of the photo first, which is almost always the sky, especially when you have the sun in the frame. If we keep our first setting as neutral, it's easy for the sky to still be overexposed on the dark exposure, or on the contrary, on a light exposure, the shadows will still be black. The good news is that we can change the order of photos in exposure bracketing on many cameras. Only the most basic camera models do not allow this change. What are the most common bracketing settings? Based on the experience from the field, we can say that 3 photos in bracketing with a range of 2 EV is ideal. So the dark photo will be first in sequence, the neutral photo will be 2 EV lighter than the dark photo, and the lightest photo will be another 2 EV lighter than the neutral photo. But what is EV or exposure value? It's a unit of exposure, which means a shift of light by 1 unit using aperture, time or ISO. In the case of exposure bracketing, it is a shift using time. In this case, 1 EV means the time is doubled compared to the original value. So if the dark exposure time is 1 second, then the neutral exposure time will be 4 seconds when shifted by 2 EV. 1 times 2 times 2 equals 4. And the light exposure will again be 2 EV lighter than the neutral exposure, which is 4 times 2 times 2. The result is 16 seconds. What are the other exposure bracketing settings? We can set a large number of steps. We can use more steps or choose a different range, which is how much the exposure time grows between shots. We said that the ideal setting is a 2 EV shift between exposures. Does it make sense to set small range like just 1 EV or less? In our experience, it doesn't. A range of 1 EV is very small, and we would have to take a large number of photos to increase the dynamic range of the photo. The more photos, the worse for us. The wind could blow, the tripod could move, something in the scene could change. Anything can happen. That's why we try to take as few photos as possible that will lead to our goal. So we prefer 3-step bracketing at 2 EV to 5-step bracketing at 1 EV. But what if we find out that 3 steps at 2 EV aren't enough? For some challenging scenes with the backlighting, 3 steps at 2 EV fall short. The sky still will not be properly exposed in the dark shot, and the light photo will not be as light as desired. For many years, I opted for 3 steps again, but with a range of not 2 EV but 3 EV. This method works without problems. The truth, however, is that a 3 EV step is really significant, and when blending photos in the editor, it required quite a bit of work and precise brushwork. In the end, I started using a different setting, 5 steps at 2 EV. Also, it goes against the rule of minimizing the number of photos, as I mentioned already. On the other hand, post-processing work is much simpler. Summary: when photographing a composition with the sun shining from the side or behind, we use the setting of 3 steps at 2 EV. If shooting against the light, we automatically set it to 5 steps at 2 EV. It's a simple and highly effective rule. However, let's remember, when using exposure bracketing, always and only in manual mode, no aperture priority. But how do we actually work with bracketing in practice when taking photos in the field? Let's explore that.
Hello everyone, I believe we haven't met yet. My name is Martin, I'm a qualified European photographer, and you can meet me on our expeditions alongside Jan and Pavel. I would be very pleased if you join me today for a short trip to a place that means a lot to me. This hilltop is a peaceful oasis in the middle of civilization. Welcome to Liberty Mountain. Today we didn't just come here for a leisurely stroll. We've come here to practically demonstrate how to capture the high dynamic range of light in landscape scenery using exposure bracketing.
We have set up the order of bracketing as we discussed in the studio: dark, neutral and bright exposures. We'll activate 3 steps at 2 EV, which is the basic bracketing setting. So, bracketing single, 3 steps, 2 EV, set. By the way, for now we'll learn bracketing with a single shot. Panorama with exposure bracketing will be covered in one of our upcoming videos. Let's take a look at my very simple composition. It's landscape and sky. What is our goal? A sky without overexposure in the dark picture and then well-defined shadows in the bright picture. At this moment, we are not concerned about the neutral exposure. Ensure that you're in manual mode. Now, working with the camera will differ based on the brand. Sony and Canon operate in the same way. If we enable live view, we always see the neutral exposure on the display, even if we have set the order as dark, neutral and bright. To see the dark exposure, we need to half press the shutter button. The display darkens, then keep holding the shutter and adjust the shutter speed to make it ideal for the dark exposure. Let's see. I am half pressing the shutter button and the display darkens a bit. Now, by adjusting the time, I can modify the exposure in preview mode. What is the ideal exposure time for a dark shot? It's the one where there is no overexposure in the sky. I have a slight advantage here because I have Sony, so I can use zebra. I'm adjusting the time until the zebra disappears. And now, with the zebra gone, there is no overexposure in the sky. For those using Nikon and Canon cameras, you can utilize the fact that most cameras from both brands offer exposure simulation in live view and histogram. Check the histogram to ensure that the right foot of the histogram is not touching the right border of the histogram box, just like it is now. That's basically it. The exposure time for neutral and bright shots is then automatically calculated based on the dark exposure time. Now it's time to take all 3 photos with as little delay as possible without touching the camera to avoid any movement. You can use a cable release and press it 3 times in standard mode. However, I choose a different option. I enabled a 2-second self-timer with the setting for all 3 photos to be exposed with one single press. Now, a side note. Sony has a bit weird system in this regard. It's the only minor inconvenience that may bother some Sony users. Hopefully, a firmware update will address this soon. With Sony, exposure simulation in live view works only in single bracketing mode, as you can see here. To make use of the self-timer, we need to switch the camera to continuous bracketing mode. Now let's finally shoot. Just press the shutter, take your hands off the camera, wait for the 2-second countdown, and the camera will expose all 3 photos. And we are done. This all applies in the case when we are not shooting directly into backlight. As we discussed in the studio, when shooting directly into the sunlight, we set the bracketing to 5 steps at 2 EV. Otherwise, everything remains the same. One more tip. The first shot, the dark one, should be without overexposure, as we discussed and demonstrated. However, we shouldn't make the first shot unnecessarily dark. If the dark shot is overly dark, then the neutral exposure will be relatively dark and the bright exposure won't be as bright as needed. So set the dark exposure just slightly darker after the overexposure disappears, maybe by 1/3 or 2/3 of EV. That's usually sufficient. Let me show you. I have pressed the shutter button. Now I'm shortening the time. Currently, the overexposure has disappeared, so I am further reducing the time by 1 and 2/3 of EV. This is sufficient. I will not go any lower, and I am ready to shoot.
And that's it. We are done. That was no rocket science, right? In case you have any questions, just let us know in the comments below. Now, for me, it's time to go down, and for you, it's time to go back to the studio. Bye for now.
And what about you? Do you use exposure bracketing? Have you encountered any obstacles while using it? We would appreciate it if you could share your experience in the comments. And that's all we have prepared for you today about exposure bracketing. We really hope you enjoyed our video, and if you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.